Good evening, I'm Dan Lothian, and welcome to The State of Race, produced in partnership with the NAACP Boston Chapter, the Boston Globe, and World Channel. It's difficult sometimes to talk about police reform without raising your voice.
While the men and women in uniform play a vital role in keeping our communities safe, some of them cross the line, as we've seen played out graphically on our television sets and tablets. The result? Cries to defund the police on one side, and on the other, flags and voices to back the blue.
In every issue, there are also those who fall somewhere in the middle. Wherever you come down, the evidence suggests something must change in how police operate.
I 100% think that there needs to be there needs to be quite a bit. But I don't think that defunding the police is necessarily the way to go about it.
Principally, we've got to figure out how to make sure that police understand their role is to protect and serve. That means all citizens. And protection means really thinking about the implications of the sorts of treatment that people experience. And we can't just continue to do things that we've always done them and expect that it's going to be okay.
But if we make changes, what should they be? And could any changes compromise our overall safety? Our goal tonight is to discuss this provocative issue with our panel and hear your thoughts on police reform. Joining me tonight are Dominique Johnson, Senior Director of Community Engagement at the Center for Policing Equity, Sophia Hall, Supervising Attorney at Lawyers for Civil Rights, and Milton Valencia, reporter on the Police Accountability Team at the Boston Globe. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Yeah.
Thanks for having us, Jeff.
So let's begin with the story of Yawu Miller. Mr. Miller was recently stopped by the Boston police while covering a protest for his paper, the Bay State Banner, where he is editor. His experience mirrors that of many other people of color in every community and state across our country.
Several officers, about 7 of them approached me and stopped me and asked me what I was doing. And when I explained what I was doing, they asked for ID, and then they asked, they FIO'd me. They entered me into the FIO database.
So what was your immediate reaction? I mean, I know you went along with their request, but what were you thinking? Was this kind of a day in the park for you? Was this something you were just going to brush off your shoulders, or was it a little bit more serious?
I've been stopped. The first time I was stopped, I was 10 years old on my bicycle. And, throughout my teenage years and 20s and into my 30s, I was stopped regularly. I think the bigger thing that I have is I've always felt from age 10 on that I'm not doing anything wrong. They can't do anything to me. There have been times when I've actually been really afraid. I'm still thinking like I've not done anything wrong. But, I was stopped once by the gang unit in the 1990s, late 1990s. Being stopped by them was terrifying. I was wearing a jacket and tie, and they were asking me, "When's the last time you were arrested?" With young black men, a lot of times, and also with people my age, a lot of times we get really frustrated with the officers. There's a sense of injustice that you feel a lot of times, that that this kind of treatment isn't happening with white people.
Yawu told us that he was fortunate to carry the shield of being a reporter, those are my words, during that encounter, knowing that he could report whatever happened to him. But Dominique, not everybody out there is a reporter. Not everybody feels comfortable in a situation like that. What does this story tell us really about the state of race and police stops?
Well, first of all, systems of public safety have often served as the most efficient tools for racial oppression. And at the core of it, communities are just safer when they don't have to call the police. And so when you're working with communities and you're hearing the context of the change that they want to make within a global pandemic that is really also at the crux of a racial reckoning, you have many people who really are concerned and passionate and want to advocate for change. But the change also has to be very clear that you have to understand the systems and the historical context to these systems in order to have an equitable approach and plan for putting forth the change that you wish to see.
And that equitable approach, I guess, Sophia, as we look at, young men of color out in communities across the country and certainly here in Boston, is it kind of a broken record that when they are out, even if they're not doing anything, even if police aren't are being called into a situation, that they could just randomly fall into trouble in a situation like that, where they're just standing around, not doing anything wrong?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things I know as a civil rights lawyer is that our laws reflect our societal values and our norms. And here in Massachusetts, we've had several cases in the last few years that have been decided by our Supreme Judicial Court, our highest court, that have recognized that the intersections of race and identity, whether that's race and age, are not indicative of criminality, but society has taught us that they are. The response and the experience that many people have had with law enforcement have taught them that they are. A black man fleeing down the street is not indicative of criminality. It's indicative of a system that's broken, that's sort of ingrained with commonplace racial profiling. And we as a community are responding to that, and our laws very, very slowly are starting to reflect those lived experiences of so many people in our community who have been disenfranchised and dealt with law enforcement in a really tumultuous way for a very long time.
And Milton, this is your beat, and I'm wondering, a police officer out on patrol or just sitting, waiting for a call, are they not unaware of what this friction is like and what is going on out in the community when they approach a person of color in a situation like this?
I think there's a deeper recognizing that we're seeing now with the Supreme Judicial Court decisions that Sophia has mentioned. Police officers don't understand because they have this in law and order kind of mentality of they're out to do the public good. So they may not recognize it, or they haven't seen it. It's not on their watch, I guess, or it hasn't happened on their watch.
But it's in the news all the time, right?
And we see it all the time,
stories,
and we're seeing it
exactly.
more. And people like Yahoo are sharing those stories. And I think we're starting to see the recognition of it actually happening through cell phone videos. And so I think police officers want to think of they're in the law and order, they're doing the public good. But I think they're slow to recognize that there are deep concerns that are real concerns.
Right. And do you think there's this recognition that a simple, question to ask someone for, their ID or something like that could escalate into more than just a typical police stop?
I think they do say that, and they talk as much as we're talking about police reform. They want to say, we're reinventing our training, and we're improving our training and reforming our training. We do recognize it. I don't think there's a recognition of the extent of it, though, and that it's real. It is real. It's being recognized in Supreme Court decisions. It's being recognized in reform that we're talking about. But those calls need to be louder, and I think they need to be received a bit more. Right, and we're going to talk a little bit later in the program about training and what should be done. How can some things be changed to improve this situation? A lot of times people will push back when they hear a story like Yahoo's, or they hear others, they see it on the news, they'll say, this really isn't happening as often. The problem isn't as deep, perhaps, as people might want you to think. But the numbers really do bear out. A recent analysis of police data by WGBH did provide, I think, a really disturbing insight into how blacks being pulled aside more frequently than their white counterparts. Here's City Councilor and mayoral candidate Andrea Campbell with her thoughts on the matter.
I think right here in the city of Boston in particular, there is this sentiment that we are excellent in everything we do, not just policing, but everything else, that we are the model for folks to look to in terms of our community policing. And I say, while we may be doing an excellent job with respect to some aspects of our policing, we still have bias in our system as well. I know this personally, growing up in the city of Boston. I know this as an elected of a district that is predominantly a district of color, and I know it from the data.
And that data shows that 69% of people stopped by Boston police officers through the department's field interrogation and observation program most of last year were black, even though black residents comprise only a quarter of the city's population. One of our viewers says that as a parent of black children, I advise them to comply to police during an interaction. Their response has been, even if we do that, the chances of us getting hurt are still high. This has left me feeling helpless and out of options as a parent. So, you know, what can be done for parents who have these deep concerns? They have these conversations with their children. They tell them to follow the rules, and their children are saying, but if we follow the rules, we're still going to get in trouble. What's the right response for a parent in a situation like this?
Well, I can jump in. So for me, I'm not a parent, so I wouldn't even begin to think about the ways in which you have to sort of talk to your children. But as a young Black woman who is sort of leading these conversations between departments and communities, the numbers are there. You know, we work with really great departments who are actively working to make sure that their departments are equitable and that they're following the right procedures and that trainings are up to date and that the disparities that they're seeing are sort of accounted for as they move through this process of transparency and accountability within communities. What we do know is that that doesn't always stop the sort of national conversation and the national outcomes that we are seeing that are sort of magnified because of a local context that gets the press and the attention. And so what we've been telling our chiefs and what I work with communities to understand is that you have to be able to make sure that while you are calling for reform or reimagination or any of those things to public safety, that community members are actively seeking out those resources that are community-centered, community-led, community-driven, and are putting those infrastructures in place so that when you are working with the departments and still seeing these data disparities, that you actively are saying, you know, we see that you are making these strides, but it's not enough. And so here's what we're going to do in the interim while you all are still doing that. So I would say, it's not easy to be a young Black person. Sort of, how do you navigate this? How do you join the space? How do you join the fight? And I think for me, the hope is that while we are sort of in the fight for our lives as young Black people, there are people like me, there are people who are doing this work within the internal systems to make the change, while the folks outside who are doing the protesting, who are doing sort of the advocacy work, are really signaling and challenging people to make these real-time decisions that are really deeply impacting us. And hopefully those can stop the bleeding.
And one of the things that we've heard in those protests out there, the rallying cry has been one of defunding the police. One of our viewers, Anne of Upton, says, isn't this phrase just polarizing terminology? And Amy of Jamaica Plain says she used to be strongly in favor of this, but has had to call the local police a couple of times for problems in her neighborhood. And now she's not so sure. So Milton, you know, help us really understand what is being talked about here when we hear the term defunding the police. What does it mean? You know, some people, again, as we heard, think that this is very inflammatory. They're confused about, you know, whether this is actually taking away all the funds from the police or reallocating funds. What does it really mean?
I think the problem with it is the branding, that name, defunding the police, and it's misled, and I think the messaging has really been lost. And I think a good example is we spoke earlier with the stop and frisk data, the FOIA data. What we need to recognize too is a lot of these people are young people, and this is their first encounter with police, and it's not always a positive one. And so this is the reason you're thinking that people are saying, let's perhaps remove school police officers out of the school system and redirect resources, social service-oriented resources into the schools. So it's not so much getting rid of police. It's not getting rid of the police budget. It's more reimagining what we do with our resources and where they're devoted to. I was just at a rally just a few weeks ago, a Back the Blue rally that we've seen. And I think really to answer your question, the messaging was lost, where a lot of people took literal the term defund. And that was that question, how do we not have our police? I think the messaging is we still have our police, but perhaps we reconcentrate efforts. Instead of 911 calls being automatically diverted to police systems, some of the work Sophia is doing, especially mental health cases, we look at other ways to kind of redirect community social service oriented programs. So that's not always the police response. It's not always the police answer, because that way doesn't always work.
And Sophia, go ahead.
No, I was going to say one thing that you said this twice, that the messaging is lost. I actually think that the information was never there. I think structurally one of the largest problems we have with communities trying at this moment in time to engage with the concept of police reform is that we don't have a lot of conversation or information or transparency around what do cops do? How do these systems work? What happens beyond the headline that I see in the paper or the 5-second scribble that I see across the news? I don't think most people really have any sort of fundamental connectedness to law enforcement. And so I think we're at a place now where we're talking about making changes, but the average citizen has no clue of the foundation of how law enforcement works and what should be changed.
But Sophia, can that conversation be had in the way that it is now, where it's basically protesters out on the street and one side pitted against another, and oftentimes the real message is being lost in all of that?
Well, you know what I'll say is that wherever there's smoke, there's fire. And I think one thing about seeing protests, seeing sort of a dramatic moment in time, is that it calls to people's attention that this is not something that you should overlook. This is not something that maybe is believed by one individual or an isolated incident. I think to see such a dramatic moment in time, people have to believe that in fact there is fire. And so perhaps the protest and the activism is not the only discussion, is not the only forum we should be utilizing, but it certainly is an important part of it, because I believe that the people who are closest to the harm are the ones that are out there protesting, and they are the ones with the lived experience to share that I think will advise the rest of us about what these really deep-seated problems are with law enforcement and community.
And Dominique, as we focus here on Boston, what are some of those proposals for reform right now?
Well, first, I think reform is sort of glossing over the fact that this system was never designed for Black people, brown people, vulnerable communities. And so that's a fundamental sort of messaging piece when you're talking about defunding, abolition, all of those things, is that reform is a trigger word for communities. And so when you're thinking about how do we bring people to the table, you can't bring people to the table with language that is not sort of culturally sensitive for all people involved. And so where some people are in this space of reform, other people are saying, this system never worked for me, I want to rebuild new things. And so the conversations that we're having are really thinking about, how do police departments work? How do you engage people to understand and educate them around the systems of public safety so that they can then make informed decisions? And so we do need all of those educational pieces to be able to make sure that folks are answering these questions as they're thinking about the plans that they're putting together. And you have to be proactive as well. So it is moving things to where they belong, 911 calls for medics and things like that. But you have to really make sure that you're pouring into Black communities, invest in Black and brown communities so that communities do not have to use law enforcement as stopgaps for social welfare issues.
And do you think that these efforts are enough? Because, you know, it isn't a new problem, right? This has been going on for generations. And every time there is a lot of noise around this issue, there are discussions of proposals and reform and things that need to be done. You know, is what is being discussed now enough?
It's a start. It's the biggest start that I've seen. So I'm a millennial, and I've never seen people blasting Black Lives Matter. I've never seen companies where people are being reprimanded for the way in which they show up when they're not supporting Black and brown bodies. I think that Gen Z and our young people are sick of this. This is not what they signed up for. We're telling them that if you go to school, if you do the right thing, if you show up and participate, that you too will be able to have a piece of the American dream. And people are fed up with that. And I think now that people are more empowered to sort of take back their agency in this conversation, you will have more of a shift. I think the young people are going to carry this work. I think that a lot of the task force and folks who are thinking about reform and reimagination, they're missing the young voice and the groups. And I encourage them to make sure that young people are part of these conversations because they have the lived experiences, they have the expertise, and they're really ready to be in the streets as well as be in these boardrooms making these decisions.
Now, I want to bring in a question from our audience, and this is to anyone who wants to tackle this. The question is from Gordy, who says, how do we make police unions part of the solution instead of part of the problem?
Well, I think first we have to change the conversation, right? We're right now at a point in which when you talk about qualified immunity, when we talk about civil service in Massachusetts, when we talk about the budgeting and what overtime pay looks like, and the other aspects, internal affairs and community engagement, that aren't funded at nearly the closer rate, we're talking from two very opposite sides of the spectrum. And at this point, we really need something to allow us to be able to connect. We need to, as a country, stop polarizing this issue as something that can't be thought of in a new framework, in a new way. And unfortunately, I think as a lawyer, what I find is that sometimes the way you cut through that noise is with lawsuits. I have found that by bringing lived experience through cases, so, for example, talking about shooting death cases of Black men with disabilities right here in the South End of Boston, those are real facts. That is real pain that anybody can understand from either side of the spectrum. It gives you something to discuss and to hold on to and to talk about change with a real framework. The death of Terrence Coleman is a place where we can have a conversation no matter what side of the spectrum you sit on. But those types of conversations very rarely happen on a macro level at our legislature, and we need to be able to have some of those lived experiences, those anecdotes brought into this conversation. And I think that will allow us to be able to have conversations with the police unions.
And you mentioned qualified immunity. Can you explain that to our audience, what that is?
Qualified immunity is a legal system that creates, in fact, a significant barrier for victims of police misconduct from being able to access justice through the court systems. It's become, again, another one of those hashtag terms like defund the police and police reform that we're hearing across the country. But in fact, it's yet another place where we've seen the laws show who they want to protect. And unfortunately, it's not Black and brown people. And so when we have a discussion about qualified immunity, it's about you talking about changing legal systems to make them more accessible for victims of police violence.
By the way, I'd like our audience to know that we did ask the head of the Boston Police Union for an interview for this program, but he never responded to our request. But Larry Calderon, head of the union, did tell GBH recently that establishing a new office merely creates a new bureaucracy. So anytime you add new layers of things, it just makes it much more difficult. Here's what he had to say.
They want to spend millions of taxpayer dollars creating it. It seems like it's about jobs and money.
And then referring to the ombudsman panel that currently exists, here's what he had to say.
If that panel's not being staffed, if that panel's not doing their job, then get a new panel and staff it and have them do their job.
So there's this whole issue of, bureaucracy, and the more that we talked, and we touched on this a little bit already, but the more that we're adding layers of panels or whatever it may be, that it just creates bureaucracy and it's not actually going after the problem. Milton, what is your sense of this?
Yeah, and to answer your earlier question too, I think part of the issue is these demands for reforms are not new, and they're the same demands. We're talking about police accountability teams, watchdog offices, and more accountability within the system. So when we talk about the Office of Transparency and Accountability, that is, one would argue, not a real office. It's limited in its power, it's limited in its scope, and part of the reason is because of the opposition from the police unions. They've always said, we can do it better, we can police ourselves, let's defer to our internal affairs office, but we've seen that's not working either. So I think the concern here is, yes, there is a panel there, but the reality is it's not working, and the numbers show it's not working. And part of that is because the opposition from the police union deferring to itself, we can handle this. And again, these are not new. These go back to the 1990s. There have been back to the Menino administration in Boston, there have been calls for a greater accountability office with more teeth, more power, more subpoena powers. This is a panel that we're talking about that doesn't have subpoena power over the police department. One could argue that's not a real panel. And I think part of the reason we're having this discussion again is because we've had it for so long and we haven't seen anything. And part of that is because the opposition from the union. So as we said, I think we want to see everyone come to the table and come to this resolution. And there's a frustration out there only because we're talking about issues that we've talked about before.
Right, and one of the frustration is voiced by Charlotte of Boston. She wants to know, who is holding up police reform legislation in the state?
the police unions. And they want to have a say and a stake and a seat at the table, and they've shown to have great political clout and muscle in the form of lobbying and campaign donations. And there's no denying that since June, since we've seen protesters take to the streets, we've seen a response from police unions at the State House. They're there with lobbyists. They have full page ads in newspapers. They've taken to social media to state their case, and it's a case that we can handle this. We've done this, and I think there's a reckoning that the community is demanding more at this point.
Dominique, another question. I want to address this one to you. Claudia of Medford, she's concerned about police officers who have been in trouble in the past, or certainly they have a record of certain kinds of actions out in the community, and they still remain on the job. Is this a bigger problem, perhaps? And if so, what can be done about these police officers who have this record of brutality in their communities?
One of the things that we sort of have been telling community members is that there is a bill, the Justice and Policing Act, that sort of covers this thinking about the national database, collecting a national database of folks who are officers who've had sort of officer-initiated activities, misconduct, all of those things. And that national registry will allow people to be able to know who is serving in their communities. And I think that you also just have to be informed about the policies of your local department. What is happening in your local department? What does the accountability procedures look like? Do you have an accountability board? And then how do you navigate those systems to make those complaints?
I spoke recently with Cheryl Dorsey, a 20-year veteran of the Los Angeles Police Department. She details her experience on the force in her book, Black and Blue, The Creation of a Social Advocate. She told us a compelling story about a culture of intimidation and more.
There was a white officer who I worked with when I was working Central Traffic Division. That's the division that's responsible for handling traffic accidents. And there was this one particular white officer who, I knew he had animus toward Blacks. And what would happen is when we respond to a radio call of a traffic collision, you get there and cars are in the middle of the intersection. And also during that time, there were a lot of Black men who were tow truck drivers who had scanners. And so they're listening to radio calls of traffic accidents, and they want to be the first one there to clear that intersection, because once they hook up a person's car, they would say, hey, I can take your car wherever you want. Well, this particular officer did not like the tow truck drivers showing up and trying to drum up work for themselves. And he would just pick at them and mess with them, and he'd run them to see if they had any warrants. And they were just there to help. Really, they were helping us by clearing out the intersection so that traffic could flow through freely. And he wound up engaging this Black man at a gas station while he was getting gas. He wasn't even doing anything other than they had a history and they knew one another. What ultimately happened is the officer engaged him. He created a situation to use force on this man. He shot and killed him. And it was only then that LAPD decided, okay, so now we've got to do a punctuous pilot on this guy. He was ultimately fired. This officer was tried 3 different times for the murder of this Black man, and he was acquitted each time.
In addition, Cheryl believes officers can be held accountable in other ways. She thinks officers will think twice about their actions if their pocketbooks are hit and if they're held accountable.
I believe qualified immunity should be done away with, because it does give an officer great cover and shelter. If I know that if I go out tomorrow and kill someone, I'm not going to be held responsible financially. I think if every police officer, listen, we live paycheck to paycheck like everybody else. And if they understood that they could be held financially responsible, it would give an officer pause. As a patrol officer for 20 years, I can tell you, I am only concerned about the things that affect me every other Wednesday, and that's payday.
Dominique, you've actually been working with departments across the country on this issue. How are other states handling it?
I think from the community perspective that many communities are just, as Sophia said, really trying to understand the structures of the departments. They're doing this virtually because we're living in a pandemic right now. And what they're finding is that it's sort of a system that's designed to frustrate you, right? And so when it's really designed that way. And working with community members, you just see the frustration because you see the way in which they really want to engage with this issue. They want to make their community safer. And so it's a lot of just maze hopping. And concretely, I say the Justice and Policing Act that's languishing right now in the House is really that sort of comprehensive plan that will be able to sort of answer some of these larger questions around accountability and tracking officers' behavior and making sure that training is put in place that's going to be able to be measured and evaluated so that you do not have people representing your community that are not going to be equitable in the way in which they sort of police everyone overall. And I would really just encourage people to work with their local community council members and everyone to ensure that these types of bills are making it on the local level into the budget conversations you're having, into sort of the conversations around the police reform, so that different pieces of the puzzle can be put together and you can sort of think about reimagining all of these frustrating systems.
Right. No, and I think that's what makes this conversation so difficult, because it is complex, right? It isn't just one quick fix. And again, as I said earlier, it's something that has been ongoing now for so long. But Sophia, I'm wondering, can we point to certain areas of the country where, certain states, certain communities where it's working, where things are working, where police and communities are sitting down together, having meaningful conversations about what really can happen?
Well, I mean, I think certainly in this moment in time, we are certainly seeing those conversations happen. We have seen communities in Oakland, we have seen communities in Seattle and Portland having really meaningful conversation around civilian oversight, around transparency. Even here in Boston, it's not as though those conversations are not happening. Obviously, Mayor Walsh has been actively engaged with the Boston Police Task Force, seeking those recommendations. The problem is we need to move this beyond just sort of window dressing, right? We need to move it beyond private conversations behind closed doors. We need to move it on to meaningful action. And that's where it's yet to be seen if that's going to happen. Here in Massachusetts, we're talking about the right things. We're talking about decertification. We're talking about increasing transparency. We are talking about bolstering the funding in the places that mean the most for the community. But the question becomes, will we do that? And will it exist beyond just this political cycle?
Right. And Milton, you said, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I think it will. I will say, for two concrete examples for CPE, we are working with the Seattle Police Department in the community and the Ithaca Police Department in the community. And these sort of places are very different in terms of community, very different in terms of the departments. And CompStat for Justice is one of CPE's premier sort of products. And what we do is we provide the technical assistance to help the departments internally, while also providing community supports to be proactively engaging in understanding the police department, but also thinking about how can we invest in Black, Brown, and marginalized communities while being able to be pulling responses away from the department that are sort of overloading their abilities to be able to be effective on the job. And so if you have a product like that in Seattle and you're making those changes in a very progressive place where community members are calling for all of these types of nuanced approaches to reimagining public safety, and then you put it in a context of Ithaca, where you have Ithaca and Tompkins County, where the mayor and sort of all of the policymakers, the department itself, and community members are really actively engaged in reimagining their public safety landscape. I think you can have some change. I think it will take a lot. It will take longer than what people expect. I think people should really manage their expectations.
Right.
I do,
and
but it's possible.
We always want things to move a lot faster, right, than they are. And Milton, you talked about a source of perhaps challenge are unions. How do you get the unions on board with whatever is done, right? You can come up with a lot of great policy issues, but the unions ultimately have to sign off on it.
They do, and I think look, there are things that police officers do well, and that's what unions want to say, and there's no denying that in Boston, community policing, Boston's been held as kind of an example of a way certain things can work, but the conversation can't stop there. And I think the unions would like it to, because they want to refer to these reports and these numbers. But if we want to dig deeper and kind of have that conversation, there needs to be a willingness to come to the table and a willingness to recognize that your own internal affairs process is not the best confidence in it. Your own ability to kind of reimagine police training and reimagine, rededication of resources. You need to have that conversation. And I think at one point, some get too comfortable or some want to point to the things that are working well without realizing that there are things that aren't. And the conversation has to be had. How that happens, I think we have conversations like these. And I think we're seeing this, one of the largest reckonings that we've had. And I think the messaging has to be out there. We talked about losing the messaging earlier. It's that these are things that are not new. They're not all new ideas. They are holding police officers accountable and recognizing what works and what doesn't and ways to improve a really important agency.
And at the heart of all of these conversations, when we're talking about what needs to change, it's always framed around the culture, right? The police culture and the makeup of our police departments. One of our questions came in from Trinity of Weymouth, and she says that she believes that super aggressive training tactics are at the root of police shootings. So I guess, let's go back to kind of who's in charge of the training? Who is carrying out the training in these areas on, helping officers understand how they should deal with people in minority communities? Who's behind that?
Let me just quickly add one more thing about the union makeup that I think helps us with this next piece of this conversation, which is that, the unions are made up of individual employees of the police departments. So one of the things that we're not discussing yet is as we diversify and alter the makeup of what our law enforcement agencies look like, then we inherently create the opportunity to change the makeup of what our police unions look like. That takes time. That takes a lot of intentional effort to diversify departments, but that's something that can make a difference in the makeup and the ability to have a conversation about what the new sort of landscape of law enforcement should look like or public safety should look like in any community.
Right. And to the question of training, who's involved in the training? Are these outside groups that are brought in to help the police officers, or is it internally within a police department?
Well, there are two ways to look at it. I think police departments want to internalize and analyze their own use of force policies and kind of de-escalation strategies. Though they want to say that's part of the conversation, it is. But you also have a system that's it's militarizing its force and its equipment. And there's a question of whether you can do both at the same time. And so I think there are different ways to look at the training and the policies that are being handled out. There's community level training and conversations that do happen, but there's also concerns of militarization and of departments that aren't necessarily at one with that community standard at the same time.
Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean, when the militarization of the police department?
Yes, when we see some of the protests and the riots and officers, there was concern. We just saw this in June where some councilors raised concerns that police would be arriving at some of these protests and rallies armed with full military style equipment. We're talking batons, we're talking shields, we're talking Humvees and almost military like equipment, some military style rifles as well. And there's a question of whether those belong in a community policing agency.
Okay. And Sophia, you brought it up, you touched on it a while ago about the need for diversity within the unions. What about the police departments themselves? We've heard from people who said we need to have more people who look like the people that the police officers are supposed to be protecting, right? We heard that from one person who sent in this response.
I think a lot of the police officers maybe are from outside of the community and they don't actually can relate to the young people in the community. So it would be nice to have someone from the community be part of it.
The recruitment process has to be more legitimate. I feel as though they kind of allow, not any and everybody, but to a certain extent, any and everybody to join the police force. I feel as though more background checks and more past history as far as mental illness, as far as their family's mental illness and things like that.
You know, I think that they have to be reflective and figure out why does this keep happening?
So, Sophia, let's talk about this a little bit more about, diversity within police departments. One of the things that struck me is that you'll see these videos of an incident that happens in some community somewhere in the United States. And in the video, it might be a white police officer trying to arrest an African American male. There may be some violence that plays out. But you'll see in the background there is an officer of color, or even an officer of color is involved in this situation as well. Is diversity alone in the police department the answer?
So let me say, first and foremost, I think it's definitely part of the conversation. I do not think that we can break down the inherent distrust that exists between Black and brown communities and law enforcement without having more law enforcement reflect those communities that they police. It is no question that there is more of a law enforcement presence in Black and brown communities than white communities. And if they are going to flood those communities, some of them need to be from there. They need to have the ability to engage and communicate with the people that they are serving. Now, you're right, though. Diversity alone is not enough. It won't abolish misconduct. It won't abolish lawsuits. I'll still have a job, unfortunately. But it will get to the accountability piece. And I believe that we can't have this conversation about police misconduct without talking about police accountability. If we don't have equitable systems that look fair from beginning to end, and that also means having fair systems that seek to hire a actual reflective community group, they have to be in communities recruiting. They have to have fair systems when they're hiring. They have to care about what the messaging they're sending with who they promote. All of that goes to the accountability. If everything is done behind closed doors and none of it ever looks like the community that you're trying to get buy-in from, then there will absolutely never be any believed accountability from that community. So diversity plays a role in all of that. We really can't remove the notion of race and identity from this conversation of having equitable police enforcement.
And Milton, I'm wondering if what plays out sometimes in these situations, so you might have a couple of officers of color who are sort of standing by and watching a situation unfold, and there is this fear of stepping in because, again, it's this culture within a police department, and or there's this fear of, if I say anything, if I try to stop this, then what are my other police officers going to think about me? Are they going to be watching my back? Is that playing out as well in situations like this?
Yeah, we saw that in Minneapolis, didn't we? Where there was an officer who was new to the job, and his storyline when he became the police officer was, I want to come into this department so I can bring about change and affect change. And he was one of the officers who stood by. So there's a real question. Officers today, in interviews later, an officer would say we have the responsibility. And there are obviously there are laws. I think Dallas was a leader in kind of creating policy that you have an obligation and a duty to report. But that shouldn't need to be made in policy and ordinance and law. It should be part of the culture of the department. And unfortunately, it's had that adverse effect where you're part of the department, part of that culture, and there is a unwillingness or reluctance to take that next step. And we saw that in Minneapolis right there.
I want to play another clip from our interview with Cheryl Dorsey. She's the retired LAPD sergeant. She talks about something she witnessed in her 20 years on the force in California.
You said something that caught my attention. It was you were referring to officers and how they handle themselves in protest. And I think you talked about almost as if they have this glee that they get to go out and have, quote, a little stick time. Can you talk to me about that? What that is that one of those urban legend things, or this is really how they view this opportunity to go and keep the peace when there's protest?
Some do, and yeah, no, it's a thing. And I hear things, cops talk, in roll call. some brag about, what is about to go down. They're looking forward to it as we're all suiting up and putting on our gear and getting our helmets and our face shields, because ordinarily when an officer is involved in a use of force, there's paperwork. We've got to request a supervisor. Supervisor's got to do an investigation. They've got to interview us. They interview the person who was assaulted to find out if it was justified. And so in a protest, in the midst of all that mayhem and chaos, it's stick time. It's party hats for everybody. And we know that that's true because you've seen videos of officers celebrating, being able to fire rubber bullets at somebody and not have to explain why they fired, as many as they did, in the way that they did. And so, yeah, it's a thing. And there are officers who live for that.
Stick time. Dominique, do you think this is the kind of attitude is prevalent within police departments, or is this kind of a one-off?
I wouldn't say it's a one-off, and I wouldn't say it's prevalent. I think it's really depending on the department and the folks who make up that department and what the culture of that department is. I think that when protests happen, there is sort of a fight or flight response for both sides. Everybody is sort of in a mix of emotions and chaos, and whether or not there are peaceful protests happening, there is a chance that someone will come and sort of want to derail that process. And then that's when sort of all of the chaos happens. I'm not going to say that individuals are ready to go out and have stick talk. I'm not an officer, and I would do you disservice to say that. What I can say is that heightened tensions, an environment where people are really emotional and talking about fighting for their lives, anything is bound to happen.
And Sophia, as you heard those comments about stick time, officers, they get their gear on, they get briefed, they head out on the streets. They know that they're going to be getting in the middle of, especially in these times with they're covering a protest or whatever it may be, they know that there is going to be a lot of tension, right? If they go out there with this notion in mind that this is a chance for me to crack some heads, isn't that certainly to happen?
Well, absolutely. And I think that goes back to the conversation we were having earlier about how do we train these officers? Because if we were properly training them to deal with those emotions and that response, then we might not see that outcome, right? I believe that that has to be a department that's indicative of one where they haven't been trained to deal with tense situations. They haven't been trained to deal with protests. They haven't been trained to deal with perhaps values and norms that they don't agree with, because that might be what the protest represents to them. But nevertheless, proper training should be able to override those deep desires to engage in misconduct, particularly when they think they can get away with it.
And Milton, you heard those comments as well. As you've interviewed police officers, what's going on in their minds? How do they approach these kinds of situations? Is this more of something that happens when they are together and they don't want to express this publicly? Or have you heard of cases where this really is the way they think and this is how it plays out?
I think police officers will say there's a general feeling of safety and public safety, and that's why they have this military style equipment I spoke of earlier, and they have families. They want to get that point across that they're there to bring the calm and bring the peace. But the reality is these things do happen. We had in Boston a police officer whose nickname was Pepper Jack because of his propensity to use pepper spray in these scenes. And I think the real issue is when we try to examine the appropriateness of these situations, and when we try to examine whether there are better ways to do these things and to carry out these situations so that everyone's safety is the number one priority, I think there's a reluctance to have this conversation. It becomes an us versus them conversation, which is why it's important to monitor internal affairs reports, use of force reports, and training reports to see where we can go with this conversation. And I think the difficulty is we don't have this conversation on both ends.
Right. I had an interesting thing happen to me this week. I was walking down the street. A police officer was coming towards me. As we got closer, he looked up, he smiled, and he said, "Good afternoon." And I said good afternoon back to him. He walked by and he said good afternoon to the person behind me as well. And I thought that was interesting. It almost seemed as if this was something, he was obviously very conscious about it and was walking around trying to make people as they came to him feel comfortable, right? Make him seem more human, approachable, not the officer who is looking to, grab a stick and swing it around. I'm wondering if the solution sometimes it's quite simple, right? It's getting officers to think about this in a human way, as opposed to new regulations and new kind of deep training. All you have to do sometimes is be human, make people feel as if you are approachable and you're not there to carry out some kind of, law enforcement event. I'm wondering if that's the solution. It's as simple as that.
We have some of those role models here in Boston and Massachusetts. I mean, I'm fortunate enough to not only be a lawyer who does police misconduct litigation, but I also represent Black and brown police officers who experience discrimination in their work. And so I represent the Massachusetts Minority Law Enforcement Officers, MAMLEO, right here in Massachusetts. And many of those officers have committed their career to being able to be the role models in their community, to be phenomenal law enforcement officers and examples. And while their stories may not necessarily be the prominent ones right now, I don't think we can have this conversation without recognizing that not all police officers are bad. It's that we have some structural and systemic problems that are at issue here that we need to get to the root of.
And as you talk about those role models, we had a question from Marlene of New Bedford, and she says that she believes female police officers tend to be better at de-escalating events than men. And so her question was, how do we get more women in law enforcement? Dominique?
I would say change the culture. So my direct boss is the co-founder of CPE, and I always ask her about experiences that she had while she was a veteran on the force. And I think you need to change the culture, but every culture is about inviting women and giving women the power and the agency to be able to be decision makers in the process and to be able to do the jobs as effectively as their male counterparts. And so I think in order to do that, you have to, again, look at the culture of your local police department. What does it represent? What are the values of the department and the values of the community? And then how are you going to ensure that if you do recruit more women, that process will allow them to be able to make it out of basic training and that they will thrive and be able to be successful, not only as street level officers, but as they look to increase their roles within the department.
And Milton, do you believe that, based on your reporting, do you think that there is this big barrier of culture that would keep women from joining police departments?
Yeah, cultural and cognitive. I think we had a report just a month ago that Black and brown police officers are more likely to be disciplined and less likely to get an award. I think that's a real issue within the culture of the department. These are real numbers that we're looking at, and the story is real. So I think once we have this conversation and we recognize that different people from different backgrounds, different genders, bring a cultural perspective, cognitive perspective, where they can look at policing in new ways. And I think that's, again, the conversation that needs to be had.
Now, earlier in the show, Milton, I know you touched just briefly on this issue of mental illness. And so I do want to talk about that a little bit more, because I know usually at the heart of a lot of the incidents that play out on the streets is an issue connected to mental illness. Willie from Somerville wants to know what you think about reallocating resources from policing per se to training in mental health and housing issues.
Well, I think they do some of that already. I think more needs to be done. Perhaps police officers will often criticize the idea of social workers. They're not social workers. They shouldn't have social workers with them in their cruiser either. So there's a training question there, but there's a law enforcement approach. We spoke earlier, there's a city council proposal in Boston to measure whether all 911 calls should be directed to police departments, specifically those that are mental health at root, with mental health questions or social service questions are at the root. If there's a way to kind of reimagine how to redirect these resources so that it's not always a law enforcement approach, a police approach, I think that would go a long way.
Sophia, do you think that mental health is talked about enough as these conversations are being had about police reform?
It is absolutely not. The fact that most Americans don't realize that nearly 50% of fatal police encounters result in the victim being a person living with a mental health issue, with a disability, is something that doesn't get discussed nearly enough. I mean, you said earlier in the show about how do parents talk to children about what to do when they engage with 911. Well, parents don't know how to tell their children because sometimes parents don't know what to do. I mentioned earlier that I represent the family of Terrence Coleman, and Hope Coleman, his mother, who called for 911 for medical assistance for him that resulted in him being shot and killed by Boston police. She will say time and time again, I wish I had never called 911. And how is that a choice? Why should any citizen have to make the choice between seeking medical assistance, seeking help, or leaving it be because you think that police presence may result in the death of a loved one? That tells us we have a problem. That tells us that the training's not adequate, the approach isn't adequate, and that the response isn't adequate.
And so, what should the approach be? Should it be more of a sort of a tandem training between the medical community and police departments, as opposed to just putting plans in place or putting regulations or having, law enforcement officers attend, this training seminar or that training seminar? Does there need to be this ongoing relationship between the medical community and police departments in communities across the country? Dominique?
So there's a two-pronged approach here. You have to think about the proactive strategies, because right now we're living in sort of a reactive space of having law enforcement even be over that purview. Proactively, if you're investing in your communities, Black, brown, and marginalized communities, you wouldn't need anyone to come and have you wouldn't have as many mental health crises because people are adequately having housing. People are adequately being able to see health professionals. People are adequately being able to be educated effectively and equitably. If you do those proactive investments in those communities, you sort of can be a stopgap before intervention has to happen from an enforcement perspective. But on the enforcement perspective, I've been working in communities where there has been a concerted effort between the mental health resources in the communities to work with the departments to review those policies of where advocates need to step in for mental health, and then how the departments can partner with those advocates to make sure that the stopgap is that communities are being represented in that way. So if an officer goes out, he's calling that mental health advocate to be a person who rides along with him to support those services. The problem is that what happens when these mental health professionals close shop at 2 a.m., from 2 a.m. to 6 a.m.? Who is making those calls and who's able to sort of reach out to those communities in crisis?
A lot of people have sent in questions prior to the program and during the program, and they all center around, what can they do? Oftentimes, it appears that these are people who are from the suburbs somewhere. They aren't involved in situations that they witness on a day-to-day basis, but they want to do something. And so I wonder if we can go around to each of you. How can we provide some hope? I don't want everyone to walk away from this and saying, wow, this is a really tough situation. It's a little depressing. But what can people do? What can we offer them in terms of doing in their communities, in their small ways, to address this big, complex issue of police reform?
Well, I'll start. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Milton.
No, I just want to say, oh, sorry, Sophia.
Go ahead, Milton.
We'll start. Go ahead. We'll start with you, Milton.
The conversation has to be had, I think, and it's not just police unions. We talked about police unions earlier, and they are an advocate group. They have a say. They want to have a say, but it's people at the community level. It's legislators. It's city councilors. We spoke earlier about ways to better diversify police departments. That change needs to happen at the state level. It needs to happen at the city level. It's not just police unions. It's not just advocates. It's everyone having a say and being at the table and coming about these ideals and reforms and making the conversation real.
Sophia, what would be your parting advice to people who want to do something?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely would agree with Milton. You're a constituent. You are the person that keeps those individuals in office. You are the voice that they want to hear for. You're the only voice, in fact, that they want to hear for. So demand that they continue having these conversations. And then the second thing that I would say is that support the organizations that are on the ground trying to do the work, that are trying to bring about these conversations, that are trying to enforce change through legislative litigation and community advocacy, because those are the groups that are going to continue doing it, even once the news unfortunately has turned away from the conversation of police violence.
And that's important, right? So many times everyone wants to get engaged when it's in the headlines, it's on the newscast, and then as things quiet down, you go back to your life, right? And you don't start paying attention again until there's a big case that plays out on your television sets. Dominique, parting words?
Invest in your communities. So as Sophia was saying, invest in those communities and those folks that are doing that work, whether it's people in the 501(c)(3)s, the small ones and the large ones and the medium ones, or the people who are doing soup kitchens and having, vegan food fridges during this time. And young people are important. They have innovative ideas. They want things to change, and they are going to be the way in which we are engaged and actively on the inside ground and the outside ground.
All great points, and I truly hope that those who have been watching tonight will go back to their communities and have conversations with law enforcement officers, have conversations with each other, right? I mean, you don't want to have this in a silo. You want to talk to people around you and get people engaged long-term for the long haul so we can address this issue. Thank you all for joining us. Thanks to our panel, Dominique, Sophia, and Milton. Our next program will be in mid-January. Stay tuned as we tackle another big topic. Have a good evening.